Good afternoon. Everyone can hear me, I think, now? Yes? Wonderful. A very warm welcome to all of you who are here in Stapleton Lounge, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us online for this annual symposium on St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm Anita Hauk, the current holder of the Joyce McMahon Hank Aquinas Chair in Catholic Theology. As we gather this afternoon, the community of St. Mary's College wishes to acknowledge and honor the native people of this area and their traditional homelands on which we stand. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have been utilizing this land and its resources for many years and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we acknowledge them and their culture within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather. This afternoon, we continue a tradition established by the generous gift of Joyce McMahon Hank. Mrs. Hank graduated from St. Mary's College with degrees in philosophy and art. You can see some of her portraits in the library. They're quite good. And she received an honorary doctorate of humanities from the college. She was also an emerita member of our Board of Trustees. In 1994, she endowed the Edna and George McMahon Aquinas Chair in Philosophy. I'm glad that Dr. Michael Waddell, the holder of that chair, is with us this afternoon. And the Joyce McMahon Hank Aquinas Chair in Catholic Theology. In endowing the chairs, Mrs. Hank said that her goal was to enhance each student's search for truth, regardless of her chosen field, to give their lives both roots and wings for the future. That vision of Mrs. Hanks is especially fitting as we gather this afternoon to hear from this year's Aquinas Scholar in Theology, Dr. Warren Kinghorn. Dr. Kinghorn is professor of psychiatry at Duke University School of Medicine, the Esther Cauliflower Professor of the Practice of Pastoral and Moral Theology at Duke Divinity School, a staff psychiatrist at the VA Medical Center in Durham, North Carolina, and co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative at Duke Divinity School. There's more information on that program in the back, as Dr. Kingflower will mention. His work centers on the way that Christians understand mental health and mental illness and accompany those with mental health problems. He is co-author with Abraham Nussbaum of Prescribing Together, a relational guide to psychopharmacology, and he is the author of Wayfaring, a Christian approach to mental health care. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kinghorn to present this year's Aquinas Symposium lecture, Courageous Surviving, How St. Thomas Aquinas' Account of Fear and Courage Matter for Life After Trauma. Thank you, Dr. Kinghorn.
Thank you all for being here late in an afternoon. I realize that I'm standing between all of us and you all and cookies and refreshments that I understand really need to be sampled, so I will be mindful of my role in today's events. I do just want to thank all of you for being here. I've really enjoyed my day at St. Mary's. I've had a chance to interact with some of you in several classes and faculty and staff, and just really appreciate the community that you have here, so thank you. It's really good to be with you. I also bring greetings from Duke. As Dr. Hauk said, I have a faculty role in the medical school at Duke and practice as a psychiatrist, but also in the Divinity School at Duke, and I co-direct an initiative called Theology, Medicine, and Culture. And if any of you, especially those of you that are students in the room, are interested in healthcare, if you're nursing students or headed to medical school or any other health professions program, and you want to study theology in a seminary and do it with other healthcare practitioners, we have programs to do that. We have a residential program called our Theology, Medicine, and Culture Fellowship. We have a hybrid certificate in theology and healthcare program that you can do anywhere, including from South Bend. And I put some information and a sign-up sheet in the back and would be happy to talk with anyone about it. It's my real pleasure today to be here for this lecture to think about St. Thomas Aquinas' account of courage and how it might relate to trauma. And as Dr. Hauk said, the title of my talk today is Courageous Surviving, how St. Thomas Aquinas' accounts of fear and courage matter for life after trauma. John gingerly slides off of his scooter and slowly, with the help of his cane, enters my VA mental health clinic room. Now 77 and living with diabetes, arthritis, and chronic lower back pain, he looks and feels much different than the teenager who completed 2 tours in Vietnam in the late 1960s. But those experiences are still with him every day. He remembers the men with whom he fought and who didn't make it back. Particular experiences, a handful of anniversary dates, a humid summer day, the smell of burning rubber, flood him with painful memories that he tries to push away and that pop up vividly in dreams. He feels that he can tolerate these memories, but most painful to him is the memory of being assaulted and humiliated during training as a black man by 3 white soldiers in his company. He identifies with the lament of Psalm 55. It is not enemies who taunt me, I could bear that. It is not adversaries who deal insolently with me, I could hide from them. But it's you, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. Roberta was married last month and wonders why she feels so tense nearly all the time. Her new husband, after all, is wonderful. He treats her with respect. He values her. He shows love and care in tender and genuine ways. Being married to him is what I've always dreamed of, she says, and she wants to be able to rest in his expressions of love, but cannot. I'm 44 years old, she says, and I've spent the last 43 and a half years in a fight-or-flight response. I don't know how to stop. Her childhood was marked by long-lasting and persistent physical and sexual abuse. Every one of her marriages and intimate relationships, including one that recently ended, was physically, sexually, or emotionally abusive, and sometimes all 3. She's not sure how to trust anyone. Trevor knows that there should be nothing particularly distressing about his work as a software engineer. He writes code for an accounting firm. The problem, though, is the laptop that his employer issued to him. It's the same model of laptop that he used in the military to monitor and surveil targets for missile attacks in Iraq and Syria. He would sit in a dark room in an Air Force base in the Mountain West and monitor a house or a village on his laptop screen, sometimes for days at a time. He would see children playing. He'd watch family routines. And then, after his superiors used the data that he provided to call in airstrikes, he would see the gruesome aftermath and assess the results. When his shift was over, he would go home to his own wife and infant son. Until he took his new job 6 months after his military discharge, he could mostly put it out of mind. But in front of the laptop, he feels waves of numbness and nausea and revulsion. What has he participated in? While John and Roberta and Trevor are all fictionalized cases and that I've changed names and some identifying details, each of them reflects the experiences of patients whom I've treated in my years as a psychiatrist in the VA healthcare system. Each has experienced what Psychiatry's Diagnostic Manual, currently the DSM-5-TR, described as one or more traumatic events: exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, either through direct experience or witnessing the event as it occurred to others. Each qualifies for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, based not only on the experience of these traumatic events, but also on the subsequent experiences of intrusive and distressing memories and nightmares, efforts to avoid both these memories and reminders that arouse them, persistent negative emotions and thoughts, and always being on edge. Knowing that I'm a psychiatrist, John and Roberta and Trevor each ask me about medications that will help with their symptoms of PTSD. John wants medication to help him sleep and decrease the frequency and intensity of his nightmares. Roberta hopes that medication will take away her perplexing feelings of sadness and distrust. Trevor asks for medications to decrease his anxiety at work so that he can focus on his coding. With each of them, I discussed that while medication can be helpful for some of these symptoms, medication itself won't heal the unresolved traumatic experiences at the heart of them. Medication might be a way to get to the starting line, but not to the finish line of healing and flourishing in life, relationship, and work. Getting to the finish line, or even making progress toward it, requires a broader and more self-involving approach that follows the general pattern that Judith Herman describes in her influential 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery. And that in a room like this, talking about trauma, I'm just aware that, there are folks who are survivors in this room. Some of you may be familiar with this book, and I want to always speak about trauma with that in mind. First, the trauma survivor must establish at least one healing relationship, maybe with a therapist or with another person or with a community, and within that relationship of trust, to establish practices of safety, beginning with her own body, and then by establishing a safe environment. Second, the survivor engages in the painful but necessary work of remembering, coming face to face with the traumatic memories, feeling, allowing herself to feel the rage and grief and sadness that accompanies them. This is painful, but it gives rise to the work of mourning, which, while painful, is, in Herman's words, the only way to give due honor to loss. And third, after this work of safety and remembrance and mourning, the trauma survivor is able to build a different future, finding reconnection with herself and with others, and possibly finding a survivor mission that may involve the pursuit of justice. Herman's threefold process of recovery is useful for many contexts of trauma, and it's modeled within many of the best known and most empirically substantiated trauma-focused psychotherapies, things that some of you may be familiar with, like prolonged exposure therapy and cognitive processing therapy. Each of these therapies encourages trauma survivors to build a trusting relationship with a therapist, to establish safety, and then to come face to face with traumatic memories through practices of guided exposure. But of course, the nature and specific goals of the therapy are going to differ according to the nature of the trauma. For John, dealing with painful memories of racial hazing and assault, recovery may entail engaging memories of the assault until he no longer seeks to avoid them, not to mention to think about the pursuit of justice. A process of therapy like prolonged exposure therapy or cognitive processing therapy, or EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, might be very helpful for him. For Roberta, recovery may entail couples work with her husband as she learns to be vulnerable in a relationship, and he learns to accept how hard this is for her and to avoid betraying her fragile trust. For Trevor, recovering from moral injury, I think in some ways all of these patients are experiencing what could be called moral injury, but Trevor in a particular way, may entail asking hard questions about his role in asymmetric warfare and about the morality of the specific operations in which he participated. And depending on how he answers these questions, to find forgiveness and to seek repair. I've been thinking a lot about veterans like Trevor in the context of the news coming out of the Middle East in these last couple of weeks. In each of these cases, though, trauma healing is not passive. It requires work, often hard and painful work, by the survivor and by others to confront painful memories and to learn new habits of living in a world that's proven itself to be hostile and untrustworthy. Because it requires deliberate action toward the good, it's also, I think, specifically moral work. Now, the terms that we use in the clinical world most commonly to describe trauma healing rarely deny the kind of moral nature of the work of trauma healing, but neither do they highlight it directly. They tend to kind of dance around it. Given that the Greek word trauma literally means wound, with the psychological use of trauma being borrowed from the language of physical wounds, it's natural to talk of trauma healing from a wound. But healing in the medical sense may or may not imply any need for moral agency. The term recovery, despite Judith Herman's strong insistence that trauma is a political category that requires political response, also doesn't necessarily entail agency. We recover from viruses and minor injuries all the time with no special effort needed on our part. Resilience, which is an incredibly popular term, but it's a term that's borrowed from physics. It refers to the ability of an inanimate object to resume its original shape when pressure or force are applied. I'm not quite sure why we use this language that's borrowed from the language of inanimate things to describe human beings. It doesn't carry any specific implications of agency. The language of post-traumatic growth does suggest specific ways that survivors learn to live and act differently, maybe by finding unexpected connection with others or finding sources of internal strength, but it's still kind of a vague term. Maybe the strongest candidate term only recently arrived on the scene is repair, which Judith Herman has published a recent book on called Truth and Repair that links trauma healing with the search for communal justice. Repair does entail the need for deliberate moral action on the part of survivors and those around them. And Herman's call for justice points to the need for a moral framework for trauma response. But in light of the important role for moral agency in living in the aftermath of trauma, it's notable that there's been relatively little attention to the role of virtue or the virtues in sustaining the life of trauma survivors. When virtue's been engaged in relationship to trauma in the academic literature, it's mostly focused within the kind of broad character strengths and virtues framework that we see in positive psychology that departs in really important ways from Aristotelian and Christian virtue theory. And sometimes it pops up in the writing of Christian theological ethicists, but not so much by clinicians. It's even more rare to see discussions of the virtue of courage related to life after trauma. There's a large book written on St. Thomas Aquinas' account of courage and resilience and psychology broadly, Craig Titus's book, Resilience and the Virtue of Fortitude. But this doesn't really engage trauma theory or the reality of trauma directly. So in this lecture, I want to first ask why that's the case. Why might we be kind of reluctant to talk about virtue in relationship to trauma? And then specifically, what might be concerns about that. I want to acknowledge these concerns, and then I want to argue that Thomas Aquinas' account of the virtue of courage, fortitudo, in his Summa Theologiae, which builds on his understanding of the passion or emotion of fear, is both a helpful contribution to conversations about what it means to live well after trauma, and actually good news for trauma survivors. So next I want to turn to why might we not want to engage the language of virtue in relationship to trauma? There's two reasons why recommending, I think, any account of virtue to survivors of trauma, and particularly St. Thomas' account of the virtues, would seem to be a very ill-conceived idea. Some of you might be wondering why I'm trying to do it today. The first is that virtues are normative. Like virtues, for all of you who've studied classical or Christian virtue theory, are habits of thought and practice that when embodied over a lifetime, lead to the flourishing of people and their communities. To call something a virtue is to stake a claim that one should seek to develop it if one wants to realize one's highest good. On the contrary, habits of thought and practice that distract from our highest good are known as, and that don't lead to the flourishing of people and their communities, are known as vices. So this leads to the practical conclusion that survivors of trauma who are caught in painful and unhelpful patterns of thinking and acting are trapped in some form of vice, and that they do well to cultivate particular virtues to replace or to counteract those vices. But that's kind of hard for me even to say. I kind of wince as I say that. Advising trauma survivors to be more virtuous, and certainly suggesting that trauma survivors might be caught in patterns of vice, sounds like victim blaming, and risks conferring shame on those who all too often have been shamed by others. And the language of virtue often comes from people that look a lot like me, like white, people, often men, often kind of labeled as social or theologically conservative. Like the language, there seems it's kind of oil and water around thinking about virtue in relationship to trauma. The second reason is that virtue theory, at least as St. Thomas develops it, is ordered, at least relatively ordered. For St. Thomas, the virtues are perfections of human cognition and action, which are operations of the created powers of intellect and will, which are powers of the living human body imbued with the capacity for abstract reason, which in turn share properties with both the broader world of living beings and with the angels. Though some virtues, such as charity or love, are not attainable by human effort and must be infused by God, nevertheless, these infused virtues still relate to and build on the stable foundation of the acquired virtues. Grace doesn't destroy nature, but perfects it. Virtue can be acquired straightforwardly by acting in ways that are consistent with virtue until those actions become solidified in habit. It's all kind of neat and clean. We become virtuous by doing virtuous things. But modern trauma theory speaks to the way that traumatic experiences fragment and destroy the ordered whole, and even exposed any conception of an ordered whole as a lie. Trauma theory starts at the point where the ordered whole breaks down. In Judith Herman's formulation, traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. In Herman's account, and I'll give a kind of extended quote here, she says, "When neither resistance nor escape is possible, the human system of self-defense becomes overwhelmed and disorganized. Each component of the ordinary response to danger, having lost its utility, tends to persist in an altered and exaggerated state long after the actual danger is over. Traumatic symptoms have a tendency to become disconnected from their source and to take on a life of their own." That's the end of Herman's quote. In the misshapen, fragmented world of post-traumatic experience, St. Thomas' virtue theory might seem kind of naive and inadequate to the task of accounting for moral agency in the aftermath of trauma. Indeed, the philosopher Lisa Tessman writes that trauma survivors display what she calls burdened virtues, habits of thinking and acting that make sense in the context of traumatic threat, like a soldier's distrust of civilian strangers in war, but that are costly for the survivor when the traumatic threat is not immediately present. Aristotle and St. Thomas would likely hold that Tessman's burdened virtues aren't actually virtues at all, in that since they don't lead to the flourishing of the individual who bears them over the course of a lifetime. But for Tessman, that's the most honest description of how virtue operates in the lives of trauma survivors. But I want to argue today that neither the fact that virtue theory is normative, nor that it's ordered, is sufficient to disqualify the usefulness of the virtues for survivors of trauma. And I want to argue that St. Thomas' account of the virtue of courage, which is built on the prior accounts of Aristotle and the Stoics and rendered by St. Thomas in Christian form, provides a helpful framework for surviving in trauma's aftermath. Living after trauma requires courage, and trauma survivors have much to teach regarding what courageous living entails, just as survivors may find Aquinas' account a surprisingly helpful resource. So let's think about trauma itself. Before considering why Aquinas' account of courage is relevant and important for trauma survivors, it's important first to step back and ask not what trauma is, but rather what trauma does. When in Judith Herman's words, certain events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning, what happens? Is the best answer a physiological one, that the survivor enters a state of prolonged hypervigilance, characterized by an overactive threat response and eventually suppressed cortisol levels? Is it a neurocognitive one, that certain memories are preserved and walled off in flashbulb form and unintegrated into the rest of the structures of memory, ready like an abscess to unleash their toxic content at any moment? Is it an affective or emotional one, naming an overabundance of fear or disgust or shame or other negative emotions in a survivor's life? While all these descriptions may be true, I think that all trauma, more broadly, does what Carol Gilligan claims about moral injury, that it leads to what she calls a shattering of trust that compromises our ability to love. Traumatic events interrupt the natural and ordinary patterns of loving and feeling the love of others that are part of our deepest nature as human beings and core to what we most deeply need. At root, all of us, all humans, although we express it and feel it in different ways, are lovers. We're born absorbing the love of others. We love first in a kind of a primordial and inchoate way, and then with more and more specificity and intentionality. As we grow, we learn from the words and actions of others what it means to be loved. And from that, we grow in our ability to love others in word and action. And after years, just countless repetitions over many years of these ordinary rhythms of receiving love and giving love, soothing and being soothed, forgiving and being forgiven, we emerge as selves capable of navigating the complex terrain of, say, like leaving home and going to college. When Thomas Aquinas wrote his comprehensive account of the emotions in human life, or as he would have called them, the passions, he centered love above all, and all human emotions as relating in some way to whom or what we love. As lovers, we seek union with those things or those people, and of course ultimately with God, whom we think will make us more complete in some way and aid our path to flourishing. This intellectual apprehension of love gives rise to desire to attain what or whom we love. And when we've attained that union, to feel delight or joy, kind of delight of being reunited with someone whom we love and we've been longing for, and we are connected to them. This synergistic cycle of love, desire, and delight, an affective triad of approach, drives our positive pursuit of what's good for us. It's some of how we find a kind of vibrancy in our life. But of course, positive emotions are not the whole story. Living in the world that we do, we recognize that there are countless threats and obstacles standing in the way of attaining union with whom or what we love. Some of these are trivial, like when an unexpected evening traffic jam delays me getting home at night to see my wife and son. I'm kind of frustrated in that case, but it's pretty trivial. Some are much more serious, as when illness or injury threaten the life of a family member, or war threatens the existence of an entire people or community. Sometimes these threats are so severe and so shattering and disorienting to us that our compass is shattered, that we're not sure how to proceed even when the immediate crisis is over. If the threats happen early and repeatedly in life, that orienting compass may never really form in the first place. These wounding, disorienting experiences that disrupt not our identity as those who love, but as our ordinary capacity to give and to receive love, are, I think, aptly named as trauma. Aquinas held that what we would consider negative emotions, and for this, these are things like sadness and fear and despair and revulsion and the like, are signs that something is standing in the way of union with whom or what we love. If we perceive that a threat or obstacle keeps us from uniting with someone that we love, we feel fear or anxiety. If we perceive that we can't overcome the obstacle no matter how hard we try, we feel despair. If the threat comes to pass and it comes on us, we feel anger if we maintain some kind of hope of resisting or overthrowing it. And if it stays on us, then we feel sadness and sorrow if the threat stays on us and won't leave and we're unable to avoid it. Usually these negative emotions serve us well. Like if I'm alone in an unfamiliar city after dark and I'm not sure quite where I am, then my natural fear of getting lost or worse leads me to be a little bit cautious so that I can get to my destination safely. We kind of need some of those negative emotions to orient us. My fear protects me and helps me to stay oriented and safe. But in the context of life after trauma, this natural emotional compass is shattered or at least misshapen. The threat that the world has been, and truthfully has been, is fixed into place, coloring interpretation of the world as we find it. Negative emotions like fear and disgust, they're intended to keep me safe and secure in the face of threat, no longer serve me. They take on a life of their own and ultimately keep me from being able to reach out in freedom toward what's good and lovely. Because the world has been dangerous and threatening, it continues to feel dangerous and threatening, whether in the moment it is or not. Trauma has not taken away my ability to love per se. As a human being, I'm still a lover, still find ways to give and to receive love, but it's distorted the emotional and cognitive benchmarks for guiding that love well in a way that allows me to live fully and freely. And this is where the virtue of courage comes in. If trauma leads to a shattering of trust that compromises our ability to love, as Gilligan says, then the first step in any trauma response, as Judith Herman makes clear, must be to establish safety insofar as this is possible, to get out of the abusive relationship or the site of immediate danger. And that requires its own form of courage. But what if this safety is established and a person continues to feel such intense fear, anger, or sadness that they're unable to move forward? If their fear is no longer serving them, but taking on a life of its own, preventing a trauma survivor from experiencing fullness of life? It's here, I think, that the virtue of courage is needed. And Aquinas' particular account of courage is worth considering in detail. So let's think about what Aquinas says about courage. As with the rest of his treatment of the virtues, Aquinas' account of courage in the Summa Theologiae draws together and innovates on 1,500 years of classical and Christian reflection on the virtues. From Plato, Aquinas borrows the view that courage is linked with prudence and justice and self-control as an organizing virtue of the moral life. One of what St. Ambrose later referred to as the four orienting cardinal virtues. Courage is specifically for Plato the virtue that regulates thumos, or spirited passion. From Aristotle, he inherits the view that virtue is a mean between two opposing vices. From the Stoics, and especially Cicero, he inherits a classification of four parts of virtue: magnificence, confidence, patience, perseverance. And from the life of Christ and from the lives of the saints, he inherits the view that the martyr, the one who's willing to suffer death for the love of God, is the model of Christian courage. Aquinas classifies courage as a moral virtue, a virtue of acting, rather than an intellectual virtue or a virtue of knowing. Courage, therefore, pertains to the will to the will more than to the intellect. But it plays a specific role within the moral virtues. Courage is subservient in this sense to justice, which is the embodied disposition to do right by others, to treat others appropriate to their dignity, and to frame the social whole in a way that respects and promotes the common good. Like its close sibling, self-control or temperance, courage is a virtue that regulates the emotions in a way that allows a person to move forward toward what is just and wise without being hindered or distracted by emotional deception or dysregulation. However, whereas self-control involves regulating simple desires for what's pleasurable, especially desires related to touch, like I really want those cookies over there, so I'm keeping myself from getting to them, courage regulates what Aquinas calls the irascible passions. And these are passions or emotions that have to do with the pursuit of something difficult to attain or difficult to avoid. And for Aquinas, as we've just talked about it a minute ago, there's 5 principal passions that have to do with something that has to do with approaching or avoiding something difficult. When a difficult to avoid threat is approaching, the appropriate passions are fear, that one may not be able to avoid the threat, and daring, if one perceives that the threat can be overcome. When a difficult to avoid threat has arrived, but there's a possibility of overcoming it, the appropriate passion is anger. When a difficult to achieve goal or good is just outside one's grasp, but you think you can still get there, the appropriate passions are hope, that the goal can be attained, and despair if this hope is lost. Courage then names what it means for fear and daring and anger and hope and despair to be felt and lived in a way that allows the person to act with wisdom and to move toward justice. And here we begin to see how courage might be especially relevant for survivors of trauma. For Aquinas, courage is the virtue that kicks in when someone encounters a threat, appraises it rightly, and does what is just and wise. Courage, Aquinas argues, he says, is a disposition whereby the soul is strengthened for that which is in accord with reason, against any assaults of the passions or the toil involved by any operations. As a specific or special virtue, courage regulates how one faces the fear of death, especially death in battle or death in the context of martyrdom. Courage of soul, he says, must be that which binds the will firmly to the good of reason in the face of the greatest evils, because she that stands firm against great things will in confidence stand firm against less things, but not conversely. It's most fully actualized not by attacking and overcoming evil, but by standing, although that's part of it, but by the ability to stand firm and endure in the face of it. Courage is perfectly consistent with anger, as long as that anger is moderated by reason. And as a mean, it's flanked on both sides by 3 vices. On one side, courage is flanked by the vice of fear, excessive fear, timor, which consists in feeling fear and being overcome by it and shrinking from what justice requires. But on the other side are the twin vices of fearlessness, which is a disposition not to fear danger enough, and daring, or audacity, which is the disposition to plunge headlong into danger in a way that's not moderated by reason. As the mean among these vices, courage is the embodied disposition that makes it possible to look evil squarely in the face, to feel appropriate fear, and to act nonetheless as reason dictates and as justice requires. Aquinas then considers virtues that are constituent parts of the general virtue of courage. And these are kind of technical words: magnanimity, magnificence, patience, and perseverance. For the sake of time, I won't discuss magnificence, which for Aquinas is the virtue of building or doing great public things here. But it's worth briefly noting features of the other 3. Magnanimity, which is arguably Aristotle's most treasured virtue, you might remember the magnanimous man in the Megalosukos in his Nicomachean Ethics, is the virtue of what Aquinas says, the stretching forth of the mind to great things, especially honors. And it's the virtue of taking ourselves and our dignity seriously. Magnanimity, Aquinas says, makes a person deem herself worthy of great things in consideration of the gifts she holds from God. This embrace of our dignity leads to confidence, faith in ourselves and others, and security, freedom from paralyzing fear. Separate from magnanimity, patience, as a virtue, names the disposition to keep the mind focused on the good of reason, even amidst sorrow. Patience acts as a kind of complement to courage proper. While courage enables us to stay committed to what's good in the face of fear, patience enables us to stay committed to the good, even in the presence of sorrow. And perseverance names the disposition to pursue what's good, even in the face of delays and obstacles. Patience and perseverance are possible only with the assistance of grace. And finally, after considering courage as a virtue, Aquinas considers courage as a gift of the Holy Spirit. Natural courage may end with death, but courage as a gift so fixes the person on the hope of everlasting life that even death cannot overcome it. And following St. Augustine, Aquinas describes the divine gift of courage to those in Jesus' beatitude who hunger and thirst for justice. So on closer inspection, Aquinas' treatment of courage is not moralistic and it's not naive. It speaks of what it means to stand in the shadow of death and to move forward in wisdom and confidence and hope. It entails clear-eyed awareness of threats as they present themselves and clear reckoning of danger. And it speaks of what it means to survive. Survive literally means to overlive or to live on in the face of the most profound dangers imaginable, including death. I want to finish by suggesting 5 ways that Aquinas' account of courage might be helpful in the context of living in and after trauma. First, Aquinas offers a clear awareness of the stakes of trauma. Just as the DSM-5 TR stipulates that traumatic events must involve exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, so also Aquinas is clear that courage is forged on the anvil of the specter of death. There is, I think, an unhelpful way to interpret this and a more helpful way to interpret this. It's unhelpful, actually profoundly unhelpful, to suggest that in the face of life-threatening, world-shattering realities of trauma, that a survivor should have been more courageous. Talk of virtue is most helpful when it's directed toward life-giving possibilities in the present and future than to some kind of recreation of the past. The should-haves of the past when no corrective course is possible. And it's not fair to speak in that way when in the immediate context of a traumatic situation. But beyond that, Aquinas makes clear that courage is only possible when the survivor has some degree of agency over whether to confront, withstand, or to flee from an approaching threat, and to act for the sake of a greater good. So for Aquinas, the paradigmatic sites of courage are the battlefield, in which a soldier risks his or her life for the sake of a greater good, and martyrdom, in which one seeks the good of eternal life even in the face of death. So regardless of how war actually is, Aquinas imagines that both the battlefield and martyrdom are things that we can approach with our full will intact. And not, for example, life-threatening situations of being robbed or confronting a storm at sea that might just kind of happen to us suddenly. Many traumatic events are traumatic precisely because the survivor did not have such agency. Furthermore, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, it's even more unhelpful to suggest that survivors should courageously submit themselves to some kind of ongoing trauma. Aquinas' account of courage is most helpful, not as a guide for enduring traumatic events as they happen, such as physical or sexual abuse, but rather as a manual for the aftermath, for the life that's known trauma's fragmenting reality. The trauma survivor regularly, weekly, daily, perhaps even hourly, experiences the visceral reality of threat, both in the lived world and in the intrusion of unintegrated, lifelike traumatic memories. It's very natural, faced with this ongoing experience of threat, for survivors either to retreat into a kind of self-protective fortress, as characterizes much of the behavior associated with PTSD, or figuratively to kind of throw themselves on the barricades, daring fortune to complete what prior traumatic events would not. So a lot of the veterans that I treat will go do really risky things in a way that I think is kind of almost a kind of denial of death or inviting death. It gets really complicated. These responses correspond to Aquinas' twin vices of fear and daring. But healing comes when a trauma survivor, fully cognizant of these existential threats, nevertheless commits to facing them and to moving forward wisely for the sake of a greater good. Courage is a virtue of surviving. Second, Aquinas makes clear that self-love and courage are inextricably linked. As above, it's not courageous to throw oneself headlong into danger without proper regard for one's life. But it's also a vice not to regard ourselves with the dignity that's properly ours. This is the vice of self-deprecation, pusillanimitas, which is opposed to magnanimity. Aquinas' paradigms of courage, the soldier and the martyr, don't stand in the face of death because they believe that they deserve it or are unworthy of life and health. Aquinas is never a proponent of a kind of masochistic self-denial. Rather, the soldier and the martyr stand firm even to the point of death because they understand themselves as called to a greater good, and it's claimed within bonds of love that dignify them and also exceed them. So too, the courage to which trauma survivors are called begins in the security of being loved by God, of moving forward with full assurance of dignity and worth. Courage never requires a survivor to subject herself or himself to ongoing trauma simply to prove themselves courageous. If this ever happens, we can imagine, for instance, a family survivor of homicide returning to the site of a murder, or of an aid worker re-entering a war zone to care for suffering civilians. It's only for the sake of a greater good, a greater love, which is chosen even as one fully and completely loves and respects one's own deep, inherent dignity. Third, Aquinas' account of courage makes clear that surviving trauma is not a project for individuals working in isolation. It's a communal project requiring both divine assistance and also the assistance of others. We've already seen that for Aquinas, the component virtues of patience and perseverance are possible only with the assistance of divine grace. But so also the confidence, confidencia, that's required for courage is itself a product of relationship with God and others, literally having faith with. Aquinas says that confidence denotes chiefly that a person derives hope through believing the word of one who promises to help her. Indeed, in his discussion of confidence, Aquinas rejects Aristotle's praise of the magnanimous man as one who needs nothing from others. Rather, he says, and I'll quote Aquinas here, he says it surpasses a person to need nothing at all. For every person needs first the divine assistance, and secondly, even human assistance, since a human is naturally a social animal, for she's not sufficient by herself to provide for her own life. Accordingly, insofar as she needs others, it belongs to a magnanimous person to have confidence in others, for it's also a point of excellence to a person that she should have at hand those who are able to be of service to her. Courageous surviving then requires not just confidence in oneself, but the confidence in and with others. Fourth, though it takes us a little bit outside of Aquinas' discussion of courage, Aquinas helps us to see why surviving trauma is so often associated with depression. In his discussion of the emotions or passions, as noted above, Aquinas defines the irascible passions as passions that relate to a good that's difficult to achieve or to an evil that's difficult to avoid. And if a difficult to avoid evil seems on the horizon but not yet present, then we feel fear or timor. And if it's a difficult to avoid evil that's arrived, but we perceive that it can be overcome with effort, we feel anger. But if this evil has arrived, it's blanketing us, and we don't perceive that we can escape, then this fear and anger can dissolve into sorrow and pain, close analogs of our modern concept of depression. Parallel to this, if we sense that difficult to achieve goods that we long for are no longer attainable, we might feel the corresponding passion of despair. Though he doesn't develop it specifically, a therapeutic approach that's drawn from Aquinas' account of courage would help trauma survivors and those who've traveled down the path from fear to anger to depression and despair to ascend from depression and despair to anger from depression and despair to anger, then to fear, and then to hope and delight and joy. It's sometimes after people have kind of begun to recover from depression that they can begin to feel the kind of anger at the kind of circumstances of life that contributed to what's going on. This would begin with attention to the close connection of courage and its component virtue of patience. If courage is the virtue of remaining steadfast in the pursuit of justice and the good in the face of fear, then patience is the grace-enabled virtue of remaining steadfast in the pursuit of justice and the good in the face of depression and sorrow. Patience transforms the passive experience of suffering into active endurance that pursues the good in the face of the temptation to give up. And fifth and finally, Aquinas makes clear that courage is intimately linked to justice and cannot be considered apart from it. Justice, as we have seen, is the chief of the moral virtues, the virtues of acting, because justice determines how the common good is attained and what's due to each person living in a community. Courage is fundamentally in service of justice, ordering particular emotions and passions such that a person is able to execute what justice requires. If justice is what Rebecca Conendijk de Jong calls an executive virtue, courage is an enabling virtue. It's justice, the vision of a community where each is treated according to the dignity that she deserves, that leads the courageous person forward, even to the precipice of death. In a modern medical culture in which healing, even healing from trauma, is often treated as an individual matter, it's critical to remember that trauma is a cultural and relational and communal reality. Although its costs are borne by individuals, most salient forms of psychological trauma are at root problems of justice, of not treating others with the dignity that's inalienably theirs, because they're God's good and beloved creatures, created in God's image, known and loved by God. And if trauma is at root a problem of justice, then justice must be the preeminent vision that guides trauma therapy and that makes courageous surviving possible. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to Dr. Kinghorn for those wonderful remarks. We do have some time for questions and comments. Anybody would like to? And we have a microphone.
And I'll repeat your questions too, so we can make sure that that everybody can hear, and I think this is being recorded also, so thank you. Yes.
Always good. Communal, right? Can't do it on your own. Right here. Thank you so much.
I first just want to say that I think the connection of theology with any type of field that is considered to be scientific is I just think that's neat. I think that the connection between theology and the natural world is just completely fascinating. And so the question I want to ask is, how did you get to this place of studying healthcare and theology kind of in tandem?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, yeah, so how did I come to think about healthcare and theology in tandem? One, thank you for just being open to a conversation about theology and health at all. That doesn't happen every place, and especially to be invited to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm a Protestant, so this does not happen in my world very much, so thank you for inviting me in. Well, for me, I grew up a Christian, and my faith was important to me, but I didn't quite know how to make sense of that in terms of my work as a physician. I remember going to medical school, and I was in Boston for medical school, and got to my first year of medical school in this enormous complex of academic teaching hospitals, and began to think in the Longwood medical area of Boston, and I began to wonder, like, what is all this stuff for? You know, there's all of these like gleaming, I mean, it's even bigger now, but all these like high-rise hospitals and labs and so much power and prestige and, you know, capital that was going in. And I remember thinking, like, I'm learning a lot about the how of the human body and human disease and illness, but I don't know quite, like, some of the big questions weren't being asked, like, what is health? And what does it mean to heal? And how do we approach death well? And how do we think about suffering? And I realized that, like, that my Christian faith had things to teach me about that, but I didn't know how to make sense of them in the context of medicine. So that led me to want to study theology more, and eventually led me to St. Thomas. And, you know, and I think it helped me to realize, I said this to a group earlier, that as a physician, like, I was training in this way of thinking about people, like the modern biomedicine, that at most is about 200 years old, which seems long to us, but it's pretty short. And as a Christian, I'm inhabiting this tradition that's 2,000 plus years old, many thousands of years old in terms of people, all these incredibly complex and frankly sometimes kind of strange, like, practices and beliefs and traditions and the lives of the saints and others. And like, I began to realize like, that's this deep well from which I want to learn. And so I'm still learning. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm curious how you, in your actual practice every day, weave in some of the stuff you talked about and the theology piece into the actual work you're doing with your patients.
Yeah, thank you. So how do I weave this in as a psychiatrist? So one is that I am a Christian who is a psychiatrist, but I'm a federal government employee. I work at the VA system. And so, I don't advertise myself as a Christian psychiatrist. Most of my patients come to me just because I'm the person that is next up when their primary care, provider asks them to see a psychiatrist. So I think for me, there's some specific ways that I talk with my patients about faith, and then there's a broader approach. So specifically, I'll ask all of my patients in doing an intake something like, do you consider yourself a religious or spiritual person? And that's a broad question. And if people say no, I might say, was there ever a time when you did, and what happened? If people say yes, and most of my patients in Central North Carolina say yes, then I'll say, well, tell me about that. Like, what's that like? And, I'll ask them about their tradition and their community. And then I'll ask them specific things. Like, most of my patients in our area identify as Christian, although not all. And for my Christian patients, I'll be like, well, tell me about, like, are you involved in a church? And if so, what's that like? And how is that for you? And if they say that they read scripture, I'll say, well, what kind of scriptures do you find helpful? And, and could you, talk to me about that? Or if they say they pray, I'll be like, well, tell me how that is for you and what's that like? And so we can have pretty substantive conversations about these things, and I'm just kind of following where people lead. And I've never had a negative response to doing that. And often sometimes I've had people say like, I didn't realize I could talk about this with a psychiatrist. I'm like, well, it's just part of who you are. It's nothing like, there's no reason you can't do that. And then that does sometimes get deeply into, like, as people are coping with trauma or with chronic physical illness or other kinds of things, and we talk about that. Like, how do you lean into your faith? What does it mean for you to really lean into this intellectual belief that you have that God loves you? What does it mean to feel that? So we can talk about that. I think more broadly, it also means that those of you who were in the nursing class this morning heard this a little bit more, but we have such a tendency in the world of mental health care to treat people either as machines that need to be fixed, so we just try to kind of tweak them, or as buckets of symptoms that need to be reduced. So we just kind of throw medications and other things at people to try to reduce their symptoms. And I think each of those is just contrary to a vision of human beings as whole persons with stories who are made in God's image. And so I think the image that I write about in my book and that I found really helpful is St. Thomas' image of the human as a pilgrim or as a wayfarer, somebody who's on a journey to God. And so, like, and that can apply in any setting. So it doesn't have to be specifically theological. So for me to say, what about this person in front of me is broken that needs to be fixed, which could sometimes be useful, but only in a limited way. But in a broader way, like, how do I think of this person as someone on a journey with a goal and a destination, and I'm then invited to accompany them on this journey and to ask what's needed right now for the journey. And that can make it so much more kind of open in terms of what's possible. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation. I wanted to know your perspective on the field of neurotheology and Andrew Newberg's work, if you're familiar with that.
I'm a little bit familiar with it. Andrew Newberg is a neuroscientist at Penn who does a lot of work around especially brain imaging and looking for, like, ways that the brain correlates with spiritual or religious experience especially. I think it's for me, how do I say this well? I think it's just helpful to be able to talk, as Andrew Newberg does and as Lisa Miller does, about that we have as humans a kind of almost innate spiritual dimension to our being, and to see that reflected in neuroscience is, I think, helpful, but it's not particularly surprising. You know, I mean, for any of us who are inhabiting the Christian tradition, we would just kind of expect that. So it's helpful as a way to oppose those that are kind of strictly reductionist materialists in the world of neuroscience. Beyond that, though, I kind of worry a little bit when neuroscience, but especially brain imaging and scanning, is used in a way that makes things seem to be real. You know, so if you put, I've thought about this concept of like neuro-authoritarianism, that if you put neuro in front of anything, it seems more real. You know, so like neurophilosophy, neuropsychology, neurotheology, neuroethics. And so like we think like, oh, it's like, it's in the brain, therefore it's real. And I think we have to resist that as Christians, because like, of course we believe that we exist as bodies. We're creatures of dust. You know, that all the good work that's happening all around us, and neuroscience and the biology of mental illness is good for us to learn from. But it doesn't, but like knowing that is, one, it's we already think it's true, so it doesn't like add to anything that we know. But also it doesn't necessarily lead us into a deeper wisdom about what it means to live well in the face of challenges. So for that reason, I think there's a role for it, but it's not something that it's not the central thing that I think is like the thing that we should be focusing on centrally above all. So, yeah, thanks.
Hi. What
Hey.
would you say would be 2 major takeaways or doctor's orders that you would give to us this evening?
Yeah,
There are 2 or 3
that's
things.
a hard question. 2 major takeaways. Yeah. Well, I think that I would say, with respect to trauma, that one, that surviving trauma is a kind of common human experience. I'm going to say more than 2 things. That trauma comes in a lot of different shapes and forms and needs to be kind of seen on its own. There's not just a one-size-fits-all strategy. But that in terms of 2 things that we can learn from St. Thomas, one is that that our emotional life, including those emotions that we wish we could get rid of or that we wish were not as strong, are in some ways, most of the time, in some ways like signs or signposts to say something about our loves. And so if I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling depressed, one way to think about framing that is like, what can I learn from my fear or anxiety about what might be standing in the way of what I love? And it helps us to kind of think about where we're headed on a journey and where we're going. And so that idea of emotions or the passions as kind of signposts of love is, I think, something that doesn't always apply, but it usually applies, I think, in our lives. And that includes those who survive trauma. And then I think with respect to thinking about courage, like what does it mean to see the deep connection between the virtue of courage and justice? And so rather than thinking of any talk of virtue as being kind of shaming and stigmatizing and like kind of or moralistic, like the virtues at their best are like practices that help us to live well, to see the world truthfully as it is, and to act in a way that's consistent with wholeness and flourishing, and not just of ourselves as individuals, but of the communities of which we're a part. So that deep connection between what does it mean in a world that is like, the U.S. is currently at war in Iran in a way that we don't know how that's going to go. Like, we're in a political moment where things are incredibly complicated. Like, you all are entering a world that's just incredibly uncertain. And frankly, you're going to need the virtues, including the virtue of courage, to live rightly in that world. And I think rather than kind of shying away from the language of virtue, to how can we reclaim the language of virtue as something that actually all of us need, because this is what it means to live in a really complicated world where there are threats all around us.
That seems like a very powerful note to end on. But we're not quite done, because we do have those cookies, and we can't
right.
keep Dr. Kinghorn from the cookies.
That's right. All of our self-control has been well activated. Thank you for sitting, listening to me. So, yeah.
So thank you so much for your talk, for your questions. Let me point out again that there's information on the Duke program in Theology, Medicine, and Culture in the back, and I will put my personal copy of Wayfaring back there too, so you can take a look as you peruse these materials. Please join us at the reception, and Dr. Kinghorn will be with us for a little bit longer. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.